Hello, it's me, Kamran Zare, here at Landrum Middle School, actually the new Landrum Middle School, in Spring Branch ISD, which is located in Houston, Texas. What I'm going to do today is I want to demonstrate and explain how to use a scroll saw. So we're going to go over all of the different parts that you need to know, and we're also going to see exactly how to use this. Now this happens to be a very easy and fun machine to use, but it takes a lot of practice for those people who are unfamiliar in order to get yourself to a point where you're comfortable cutting out random lines, because this doesn't do a very good job cutting straight lines. It does a great job cutting curved lines, for intricate details that you might want to cut. Now, the machine that we're going to take a look at happens to be a DeWalt DW788, but any scroll saw that you might end up using is going to have pretty much the same features as this one. Of course, this video is made specifically for my students so that they can prepare themselves to take a safety test if they weren't here whenever we actually went over the machine. So, the first thing that I want to do is go over the parts, starting from the bottom, working our way up. Obviously, you can see that this machine seems like it's floating in the air, but what it's actually doing is it's sitting on this base. So you can't see the bottom of the base, but this black area right here is all considered the base. Coming up from the base, we have this knob right here in the front of the machine. And this knob, if we loosen it, allows me to tilt the table left or tilt it right. This is called the angle adjustment knob. Coming up from there is actually this lower part, and you can see as I'm moving the lower part, it started making the machine move just a little bit. This is called the lower chuck, right? And what this does is it clamps the bottom of our blade. Coming up from there, we have this flat surface. This is where we're going to keep our workpiece flat so we can cut. This is called the table, okay? Now, might not be able to see it very well, but there's nothing here. And typically, you'll have a blade here. And so I don't have the blade in there because I want to demonstrate how to put the blade in correctly. So this is a blade. So it's extremely thin and typically pretty fragile if you're rough on these machines. But coming up from the table, we have this piece of metal right here, and this is called the hold down foot. The purpose of the hold down foot is kind of two parts. Number one, it keeps you from running your thumbs or fingers, or it helps prevent you from running your fingers into the blade, but also this helps hold down your piece of wood so it doesn't jump up and down and go wild. Now, will this prevent you from cutting yourself? No. Will it prevent your piece of wood from jumping around? No. Will it help in both of those areas? Yes. So lots of woodworkers like to get rid of these. Since I'm working with students, I like to keep these in place so you can get used to it. Now, above the hold down foot is this part, which is called the upper chuck. It's the same thing as the lower chuck, and what this does is it clamps the top of the blade. Coming up from there, we have this part right here, this lever. This is called the tension lever. This is a tension lever, okay? This piece right here that you can see moving around, this is an air hose or a blower hose. What this does is it blows away the dust so we can see the line that we're trying to follow as we cut. On the very top, we have this red rocker switch. This is the power switch. And then behind that, we have this dial, which is our speed adjustment. So, just to quickly go back over these parts without explaining them again, this is the base. This is the angle adjustment right here. This is the table. Down here we have the lower chuck. Up here we have the upper chuck. In front we have the hold down foot. This is the tension lever. We have the power switch on top. And we have the speed adjustment. And then this flexible hose is the air hose. So, first thing that we need to do anytime we use any type of woodworking machine is we need to make sure that we take care of all of our safety items that are extremely important. So there's 5 particular items that I talk to my students about. First one is you got to make sure you're wearing your safety glasses. Once you've got your safety glasses on, if you have long hair, you need to tie it back. There's nothing worse than having hair in front of your eyes so you can't see, or even worse than that, having your hair stuck in a machine and it's pulling you closer and closer. So tie your hair back. Of course, I don't have that problem. Next thing is if you've got loose clothing, your shirt is too baggy, it's billowing all over the place, you need to make sure that you tuck it in so it doesn't get hung up in a machine. You also need to remove any dangling jewelry, lanyards, necklaces, long dangling earrings, rings, watches, or bracelets that might get hung up in a machine. And then, of course, my favorite, which on cold days students seem to complain, you can't wear a sweater or a jacket. We need to see from your fingertips to your elbow. There should be nothing in the way that might get hung up in the machine. Once you've taken care of that, you should have a plan as to what you're going to do at the scroll saw before you come here. In my case, because I'm just going to demonstrate, I'm going to take this scrap piece of wood that I've already drilled some holes in earlier, and I have two shapes that I'm going to cut out. One is going to be a circle, but I want that circle to be trapped on the interior of this piece of MDF. And then the other one is a rectangle. All right, so I'm going to start with the rectangle, and then I'm going to go to the circle. And I'm going to show you each of those steps, right? Because they're a little bit different for them. So before we do that, though, when I get to the machine, I first want to make sure that it's off. I see it's not moving. I also want to make sure it's unplugged, and this machine is unplugged. I want to clear off the table to make sure there's no sawdust on the table that's going to prevent me from holding my piece of wood flat. And then I want to do some checking about my blade. I can't really check my blade because my blade is in my hand and it's not attached to the machine. So I'm going to demonstrate how to actually attach your blade to your machine. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to turn the tension lever to loosen as much tension as possible. That's going to allow this upper arm to lower down. So you'll see this upper arm kind of sinks as I do that. So I've released all the tension. Once I've done that, I'm going to make sure that I've got my upper chuck loosened and I've got my lower chuck loosened as well. I'm then going to take my blade, and you will notice that this blade has teeth, of course, but the teeth are only going in a certain direction. So if we think of this as a triangle like this, right? Sort of part of a right triangle. What I want is the base of that right triangle to be on the bottom side, and the peak of that right triangle, I want it to be on the top. So I want my teeth pointing down. So what I'm going to do is take that, make sure it's pointing in the right direction, and I'm going to slip it through the table. Of course, some scroll saws have a throat plate or an insert plate right here. This one does not. The table is solid. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that this blade is oriented correctly, and I'm going to hold it in the bottom chuck, and I'm going to tighten it down. Okay? Now, I want to make sure that it's tightened down in the bottom chuck, and it is. Then, this typically, I use 2 fingers on my left hand and my 2 fingers on my right hand. What I do is I take my pointer finger, put it on top of the upper chuck to press down, and then I take my thumb and I press back on the blade so it falls into the chuck. And then with my other hand, I'm going to tighten this. Now, the reason why I want to make sure that I'm pressing down on my upper chuck is because I want to provide as much squeeze so when I use the tension lever, it pulls the blade as tight as possible, or tight enough for me to cut. If I do not make sure that my blade is pulled tight, it will not cut. All it'll do is flop your blade over and it'll break it. Okay? So once I've done that, you can see that my blade is really floppy, right? It's not pulled tight. So the next step is I'm going to take my tension lever and I'm going to turn it this way to 5.5, which is the maximum. And you can see now, whenever I pluck this blade, it has a high-pitched sound like a guitar string. So that's what you'd normally do when you get here. After you've made sure it's unplugged and turned off, you want to pluck the string, not the string, the blade, to make sure that it's got a high pitch. It needs to be pulled tight. So this will allow us to cut. This will not allow us to cut. All this will do is break the blade. So I'm going to go ahead and tension it again. Now, because I'm going to be cutting using the hold down foot, the next thing that I want to do is take my piece of wood and I'm going to push it up against the front side of the blade. And then on the left hand side, we have this wing nut or this thumb screw. And what this does is it allows me to loosen my hold down foot, bringing it up and down. Now this hold down foot kind of rests at an angle. And what I want is the lower part of that angle to touch the piece of wood. I don't want this to sit flat on my piece of wood. I just want this curve right here to touch my piece of wood. What this will do is this will allow me to make sure, A, I don't run my thumbs in, and B, this will not jump up and down. You can see I've got this actually set pretty tight, but that's okay. It's not a big deal. Now, the next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to take this air hose and I'm going to place it behind the blade, pointing in this direction, kind of pointing towards me. What this will do is this will blow away the sawdust. Some people like to put it behind the blade, some people put it on the side of the blade. Typically what happens is I start it here behind the blade and I see it if it's pointing in the right direction. What we want to do is blow away the sawdust, that way we can see our cut line. Okay? So once I have all of these issues taken care of, I'm going to make sure that it's switched in the off position, and I'm going to go plug the machine in. So I've got my outlet over here. I'm going to plug it in. All right, and now let me demonstrate how this machine works. When I turn it on, all it does is move up and down. This is not a sewing machine. I can adjust the speed slowly all the way to as fast as possible. Let me explain what we should do whenever we are cutting and we want to adjust the speed. Typically when people first start and they're kind of nervous, they want to put it at the lowest speed. What that does is it creates a more powerful jerking motion up and down, and it can cause you to make your piece of wood jump up and down more than if it was going a little bit faster. So my advice to people is I always leave it at the highest speed for the kind of things that we do. If we're doing really delicate, intricate work and you have good control, you can change the speed however you want. But just because the machine is moving fast does not mean that you need to move fast. When we have it moving fast, it will cut smoother, but you can take your time and go as slow as you need. However, if you take your time too much and you don't move and you start binding the blade, you're going to start burning your piece of wood. So just keep that in mind. Now, once I've got all of that set, what I want to do is stand directly in front of the machine. Typically, I like my feet to line up with the legs and the base. What this does is this allows the center of my body to line up with the center of this blade. This line that I can draw from this blade all the way to my belly button or the buttons in my shirt, this is called the cut line, right? And in this case, it's an imaginary line because I can't actually see any line on the table, but this is called the cut line. What happens on any machine like this is anything that is following that cut line and we press it into the blade, what's going to happen is it's going to cut right on that line. So if we're trying to push our piece of wood and the line that we're cutting is not directly on that cut line, we're not actually going to get it cutting on that line. Okay? So this is an important thing that I'm probably going to mention as I'm cutting. Now, we also want to pay attention to the fact that I don't want to cut exactly on the line. What I want to do is leave myself a little space, just in case I make a mistake, or just in case I want to sand in and get it exactly where it needs to go. Also, the other thing is you just got to cut confidently. You've got to just commit to it and follow through. If you do a lot of pushing and pulling and pushing and pulling, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have a lot of jagged edges. You want to cut nice and smooth, and sometimes it won't be exactly where you're supposed to cut, but it looks better because it's nice and smooth. So, once I've taken care of that, I'm going to turn the machine on. Now, what you do need to know is this blade only cuts on the side that's facing you. It doesn't cut on the left, it doesn't cut on the right, it doesn't cut on the back. So if you're not pushing into the front of the blade, it will not cut. So, the first thing I want to cut is this rectangle. It's got two straight lines that are 90 degrees to each other. So I'm going to start with the long line, and I'm standing right here. My feet are not going to move. The only thing that's going to move is my hands. I'm going to slowly push into the blade. I'm not going to force it. I want the blade to do the work. You can feel if the blade is comfortable with the speed that you're moving. If it feels like you have to push, that means the blade is not comfortable. You need to slow down your motion. Okay? So I'm simply just following the line because the line I want to cut is on the imaginary cut line. Now, I'm going to pause for a second because the next line is going towards you, the camera. So what I've got to do is figure out, how do I handle this situation? Most students just like to round that corner, and that's fine. That's the way I'm going to demonstrate it. Is it going to leave me a nice sharp corner? No. But I'm going to use this opportunity to show you how to understand how to turn this piece of wood. If the line I want to cut is pointing in this direction, I have to think and ask myself, which direction should I turn this piece of wood so that I can get this line that I want to cut pointing at me faster? Do I want to go clockwise, which will make me do a full 270 degrees and before I can get on that line? Or do I want to go counterclockwise, which will allow me to get onto the line in 90 degrees? So we always want to go with the shorter distance, and so I'm going to turn it this 90 degrees counterclockwise until that line falls on my imaginary cut line. So here I go. And there we are. And I'm going to follow my line. And this is just a hand-drawn line, no big deal. Once I'm done and I've pushed all the way through, I turn the machine off, keep my hands away from the blade, and you can see that I've got a rectangular piece that's been cut out. Now, what happens if I turn in the opposite direction at that corner? Well, what's going to happen is, instead of cutting this way, I would have cut this way. And you'll figure these things out as you work. So I'm just going to throw that piece away. Now, the last one that I want to do is the cut this oval or this circular shape, but leave it to where it leaves a hole in my piece of wood. So, the way that I'm going to do this is I have to remove the top part of the blade. I'm going to loosen my lever, then I'm going to loosen the upper chuck until I have the blade loose only on the top. Then I'm going to raise the arm, and I'm going to take my piece of wood, I'm going to slide it underneath the hold down foot. And then I'm going to find that hole and insert my blade into that hole. Now, before I do anything else, I need to adjust this hold down foot, because what it's going to do is going to prevent me from making sure that the blade is tight. Excuse me. Once I have that done, I'm going to go through the same process again. I'm going to use my left hand to hold down the upper chuck and also to make sure the blade is pushed back into the chuck, and I'm going to tighten it down with my right hand. We can see that the blade is loose, so I'm going to take the tension lever and I'm going to turn it, and so now it's tight. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen the clamp that holds the hold down foot, and I'm going to lower the hold down foot till it rests on the top of the piece of the wood. So that's good, and I'm going to bring my air hose back. Once I've got that done, I'm ready to cut. Now this is a circular path, so you need to think of a circle or a curve as a bunch of small little short segments of straight lines. And so what you've got to do is get those small little imaginary short segments laying on top of your imaginary cut line in order to do this. And I've got my blade trapped in here. When I'm done, I don't want to cut out the border of my piece of wood. I should be left with just a curved object that falls out of this piece of wood, making this some sort of P shape. So I'm going to turn it on, and you can go clockwise or counterclockwise, whatever you're more comfortable with, and you're going to get yourself to your line. And again, you want to make sure that your curved line falls on your imaginary cut line as you go. So I'm just going to continue to cut around this curve and get my way all the way to the end. And as soon as I'm done, I got back to where I started, turn the machine off. Now, to remove this, I've got to undo the tension lever. I've got to undo the upper chuck, lift up the arm, slide this out, and remove my piece. And there's my piece. This was all hand drawn, so no big deal. But what I have here is I have a piece of material that's been removed from the center, without cutting through the sides of the board. Now, the correct order of operations is I should have cut the inside piece first, because when you scroll saw, you always cut the hardest things first. And in this case, it was the inside piece. We also cut insides, so that way we have the maximum amount of space to hold onto around the outside. Okay, so I actually did this backwards. But here's my piece, and both of these are just trash to me, so I'm going to toss them in the Now, the last things that you would need to do here is obviously put the blade back in the correct position. You would also need to clean up. So, great thing to do is blow everything off onto the floor, sweep it up into the dust collector, you're good to go. Then you want to make sure you unplug the machine. So I'm going to unplug the machine and there. So that is how you use the scroll saw. Hopefully that explained it to you so that you, if you're my student, you can pass the paper test and demonstrate that you understand how to use this. So thank you for watching. Take it easy.